Hi guys, and welcome to Terminal Velocity. Today we're going to be doing the 9th episode of the Zelda vs. series, Twilight Princess vs. Link's Awakening. These are both really great games, so this should be a very close matchup. The first category we have is creativity. While Twilight Princess definitely has a lot of creativity in a lot of different aspects, it is very similar to Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask in a lot of ways. And while Link's Awakening is fairly similar to A Link to the Past, it is not as similar as Twilight Princess, and it has a lot more creativity. So Link's Awakening gets the point in this category. The next category we have is combat. And while Link's Awakening does have a fair variety of combat for a 2D Zelda game, Twilight Princess might have the most combat with all of the different scrolls and moves you can learn, which with techniques such as the helm splitter and like the side roll and the shield bash. There's a lot of different things you can learn throughout the game, and it makes the combat much more fun and various than a Link's Awakening. The next category we have is exploration. Link's Awakening is not known for its exploration at all. It doesn't have that big of a world, and while it does seem big, it's because it requires a while to get from one small section to another using items. Where Twilight Princess, you have access to like the full Hyrule field almost immediately, which is massive, and there are tons of different boulders and caves to explore and find new things, which is very interesting. The next category we have is items. And while there are a good amount of items in Link's Awakening for a 2D Zelda game, there are only about 8 of them. While Twilight Princess has a ridiculous amount of items, like having almost 20, including some extra ones such as bomb arrows and the fishing rod. So there are a lot more items in Twilight Princess, and they have a lot different variety. Because Link's Awakening, all the items basically do the same thing, like bow, boomerang, magic rod. They're all basically very similar. So Twilight Princess gets the point in this category. The next category we have is enemies. And unfortunately for Link's Awakening, this is another category that it doesn't have very much variety in. Well, there are a couple of different types of bokoblins or moblins and Octoroks, and maybe a couple various overworld enemies. They're basically all very similar, and Twilight Princess has a lot more overworld boss variety, with having a lot of different enemies. Plus the dungeon bosses, or not bosses, the dungeon enemies are also very different, including you even have to fight Gorons at some point, which is very interesting, which gives Twilight Princess another point in this category. The next category we have is dungeons, and why you would think Twilight Princess would have a huge advantage in the dungeons category because of its 3D nature and because it has a lot of very great and well-known dungeons such as Arbiter's Grounds, Temple of Time, Hyrule Castle, just all that. However, Link's Awakening might have the best 2D dungeons in the entire series, like Eagle's Tower, the Key Dungeon, and Turtle Rock. There are tons of really great dungeons in Link's Awakening, and there aren't really any actually bad ones, so unlike Twilight Princess, there's actually some, like, all of them are good, which means Link's Awakening gets the point in this category. The next category we have is characters. Link's Awakening has Marin, which might be the most developed and interesting character in the entire Zelda series. However, all of the other characters in the Link's Awakening game have very little personality and are not too memorable, where Twilight Princess has many different personalities that are all very memorable and distinct. So I'm going to give Twilight Princess the point in this category due to its more variety and difference. The next category we have is story. While Twilight Princess does have an amazing and interesting story that is probably better than Link's Awakening story, there are tons of similarities to the story from Ocarina of Time, which makes it not as memorable, whereas Link's Awakening has a very distinct personality in its story that's very different from all the other games. So I'm going to give Link's Awakening the point in this category. The next category we have is emotion. And this is actually a very, very close section, because these are two of the most dark and depressing Zelda games, with Twilight Princess just overall being very dark and depressing, while Link's Awakening has a lot of different like spikes where it gets very dark and depressing. But in general, Twilight Princess does have a more dark tone that's more consistent, while Link's Awakening kind of balances both very dark tones and very happy and joyful tones. So I'm going to give Twilight Princess the point for being more consistent. The next category we have is progression. Link's Awakening has very good progression, from starting out easy, and then getting progressively more difficult, and then at the end being pretty hard. Even though I would say the 8th dungeon is probably easier than the 7th one, it still progressively gets harder in general. While Twilight Princess has very awful progression. I'm a fan of Twilight Princess, but I still have to say it has awful progression. It starts out like slightly easy, kind of, and then it like stays the same for a while, and then it gets like way harder, and then it like goes back. It's not good progression. The next category we have is side content. While Twilight Princess doesn't have too much side content, it has the bug side quests and a couple other side quests. It doesn't have that many, but Link's Awakening has literally no side content, except the new remake has the Dungeon Maker, which definitely puts Link's Awakening ahead of Twilight Princess in this category, and basically gives it an instant point. The next category we have is music. And in both of these games, basically every single song is a great song and it's very interesting to listen to over and over. But in general, there are a lot more songs in Twilight Princess than Link's Awakening. So I'm going to give Twilight Princess the point in this category. The next category we have is bosses. And while there are many great bosses in both games, Link's Awakening's bosses, a couple of them are reused from A Link to the Past, while the others are not as creative as they could have been, as seen in games such as the Minish Cap and A Link Between Worlds and the Oracle games in 2D. So Twilight Princess does have very creative bosses. They aren't the hardest bosses, but they are more creative in general. So I'm going to give the point to Twilight Princess in this category. The next category we have is art style. And once again, if it weren't for the 2019 Link's Awakening remake, this would be an easy win for Twilight Princess. But the new Link's Awakening game has a very interesting toy-like art style that works very well with Link's Awakening in most cases. And while Twilight Princess does have an amazing looking art style, it is not, it doesn't really fit as well. It does fit very well with the dark tones, but the toy kind of art style is almost perfect for Link's Awakening. So it gets a point in this category. The next category we have is World. And while, as I mentioned earlier, Twilight Princess does absolutely have a much bigger world than Link's Awakening, I also mentioned earlier, Link's Awakening has a very densely packed world with tons of secrets on basically every single square of the map. And it's very interesting to explore every single one in depth, especially in the new 2019 remake. That adds a lot more different secrets with the secret seashells. So Link's Awakening gets the point in this category. The next category we have is difficulty. And while neither of these games are particularly hard, even at the hardest part, Twilight Princess is known for being one of the easiest Zelda games, while Link's Awakening isn't as much, and it's a little bit harder to beat some of the dungeon puzzles and like bosses and things. So in this case, I'm going to give the point to Link's Awakening again. The next and final category, which will be the tiebreaker category, is replay value. While I personally like Twilight Princess more, and would play it again and again because I really enjoy it, I understand that Link's Awakening is by far a better game to go back to after you beat it, with the different secret things in the newer versions, the color dungeon, the secret cutscene at the end if you don't die. There are a lot of things that make Link's Awakening more fun to go back to in general, even though I would personally prefer Twilight Princess. So Link's Awakening gets the point in this category, making it win the game, barely coming back in the very end. Wow, it looks like Link's Awakening pulled off another upset against a larger 3D game. Which of these two games do you like more? Tell me below in the comments. And also, if you like this content, be sure to like and subscribe, and watch some of my other videos. Thanks for watching Terminal Velocity, and I hope to see you again next time. Bye.